because from Russia's point of view, and understandably so, the United States doesn't want to play by any single rules whatsoever.
So recently, Jeffrey Sachs sat down with Tucker Carlson and talked about why he believes Trump has failed to secure peace with Russia over the Ukraine-Russian war. Despite all of Trump's campaign rhetoric that he was going to create peace there within 24 hours, it actually seems like the war's escalated recently, especially after Ukraine's attack on Russian nuclear bombers. So let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
7 months ago, Donald Trump gets elected on the claim, this is a disaster, I'm going to fix it. And 7 months later, it's still not fixed, despite his, I think, sincere efforts to fix it.
I agree with you.
So why isn't this fixed?
Let me just say, in terms of chronology, one more piece to add, just to add to the historical note. The decision to invite Ukraine, and even more crazy, by the way, the country of Georgia, which is in the South Caucasus. And people should take out a map and look at this region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea and ask themselves a question. Is that the North Atlantic? Because NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Or is that the soft underbelly of Russia in the Caucasus Mountains? This is insane.
It's more Asian than European. But
It's the South Pacific now, almost.
In some ways.
Well, it's literally Asia.
Yeah.
Because the European demarcation is the crest line of the Grand Caucasus. So we're inviting an Asian country, Georgia, into NATO.
Stalin's home nation.
And fascinating, why Georgia? Because look at the map also. Not only is it Asia, not only is it not the North Atlantic, but it completes the encirclement of Russia in the Black Sea. So it's not a random choice. It's Palmerston, 1853, brought to life by Brzezinski, 1997, and lived out by George Bush Jr. in 2008.
In the Bucharest summit, George Bush openly boasted that Ukraine and Georgia would be part of NATO. At the very tail end of his presidency, he had been a total disaster on foreign policy by that time, by far, over catastrophes in Afghanistan, in Iraq. But his last fell effort to kind of rattle neocon sabers against yet another power was this promise that NATO would expand to include Ukraine and Georgia one day, following up from what Clinton had essentially started out in the 1990s. This is what led to a lot of the animosities that Russia has toward the U.S. today. And actually, Russia, after that point, maintained pretty good relations with the U.S. despite all this for about 6 years, until the U.S. tried to consummate regime change in Syria. And that really is what made Putin persona non grata. He had the gall to stop a regime change on behalf of Al-Qaeda in Syria, at least according to the U.S. state and the corporate media.
He announced this. Putin says, no, this is not going to be. This is craziness. In the meantime, also remember that in this incredible hubris of the United States, this mad arrogance, in 2002, the U.S. unilaterally walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. So the U.S. destabilized the nuclear arms control framework fundamentally in 2002. This is not sufficiently appreciated because from Russia's point of view until today, and literally on a strike on strategic bombers last week, Russia believes that the United States has killed the nuclear arms framework. So we're talking about not vague national security concerns. We're talking about fundamental national and world survival terms. Because from Russia's point of view, and understandably so, the United States doesn't want to play by any single rules whatsoever. So I just want to say,
yeah, hard to disagree with them there. That certainly is the source of much of the animosity between Russia and the U.S. A lot of it's over NATO. A lot of it's over that it bombed a European capital for 42 days, Sarajevo. in the Balkans. A lot of it is that it tried to consummate regime change in Syria, and Syria was Russia's ally, and the U.S. has supported the Aegis missile system up to and almost on the border of Russia, which has the capability of firing dual-purpose weaponry, meaning it does have offensive capabilities. So it's no mystery why the animosity started, but he dropped there why it's being hard to conclude a peace there, because recently Trump boasted about the fact that Ukraine hit Russia hard. It hit their nuclear bombers on the runway. That story, more from 41 to 7, maybe 4 got affected and 3 can get repaired. But that seems to have been the biggest escalation of the war since Trump got in office. And preceding that, Trump was on national media and corporate news saying stuff like, well, Putin wants all of Ukraine. He wants to take all of Ukraine, and he's going to get it unless we stand up to him. It's essentially the same thing that Biden and the Democrats and the Jake Sullivans of the world and Keir Starmer and Macron have said, and the von der Leyen, all the biggest warmongers that want to escalate this war with Russia, dedicate even more resources to it, prolong it even more, saying the same things there. And it's not hard to imagine why this war has dragged on. Russia doesn't view the U.S. as a trustworthy partner in terms of diplomacy. And why would you, especially after what's happened with Israel and Iran now?
That this Project Ukraine not only goes back to the 1990s, but the invitation was in 2008. The Russians said no. So in 2010, a pro-neutral president, Viktor Yanukovych, is elected. He comes to power on the basis of no NATO enlargement because he knows how dangerous that is for his country, being between East and West. He says, stay away to both sides and we will keep calm. In February 2014, the United States conspires in a coup that overthrows Yanukovych. And that was a coup in which the U.S. was deeply engaged. My colleague at Columbia University, my colleague now, Victoria Nuland, was the point person on the ground. Jeffrey Piat, who was a senior official for Biden back in 2014. He was ambassador, in fact, to Ukraine, and then became a senior State Department official in the Biden administration afterwards. Senators, Lindsey Graham, he was out there, John McCain. This was a typical U.S. regime change operation. What do I mean by that? It means Yanukovych is in the way of our plan. We need to get him out of the way because we need to expand NATO. And so Yanukovych is overthrown on February 22nd, 2014, violently, within a nanosecond. Rather than saying, hey, the president should come back, a violent group overtook the government buildings, President Obama recognizes the new government.
Yeah, right off the bat. And what has been revealed, too, is that USA dumped $5 billion into the Maidan coup. Some of it might have been spent on other endeavors related to Ukraine, but a huge portion of that, at least, was spent funding this coup to overthrow Yanukovych, the democratically elected president of Ukraine. For all the talk of defending democracy, it's the CIA and the State Department that participated in this coup by way of financing via U.S. aid. That is absolutely crazy. That is really what started a lot of these conflicts, the conflicts in the Donbass that transpired thereafter. Several provinces in the Donbass held votes deciding that they didn't want to be part of Ukraine anymore. Crimea, too, by a margin of like 97%. And yet, Ukraine went to war with those areas. And that started in 2014. A lot of people think like this war just began in 2022, especially if all you watch is CNN and MSNBC, but it couldn't be further from the truth.
Within a nanosecond, because this is a U.S. game. This is the whole point. If you were a serious country that believed in democracy, President Obama would have said, we don't accept mobs entering our buildings and overthrowing our government. President Yanukovych is the elected president, and he is the one we recognize. No, within a nanosecond, Obama recognized the new post-coup regime, the one that Zelensky leads today.
But that wasn't an insurrection because it didn't involve carrying away a lectern from one hall of Congress. That's what they mean by insurrection, not the actual overthrow by the CIA and State Department of a democratically elected government.
And amazingly, according to script, honest to God, one of the first things that this regime brought to power by an American participation in a coup. Not only Americans, there were Ukrainian right-wing forces also, but America played its active role. What is one of the first things they say? They say, we think Russia should exit from Crimea. What does that mean? We think the Russian military base needs to leave Crimea. Now, it was interesting, under Yanukovych's term, Yanukovych and Putin had negotiated not a territorial annexation of Crimea, but rather a 25-year lease. Thank you very much, that Russia will keep its naval base in Crimean Sevastopol.
That's akin to neutrality, or at least a neutral position compared to what we have now. But what the deep state hates most is neutrality, because then you're not saber rattling with enemy powers and, provoking a conflict where constant streams of money can go to Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Boeing. Of course.
But immediately, the post-coup regime reads the script and says, we don't think Russia should be in Crimea. In other words, subscript, NATO is going to take over the military base in the Black Sea. That's when Russia immediately organizes a referendum, and Crimea is taken into Russian hands. This wasn't an innocent event. This was part of the playbook of the United States. The war started in February 2014. It didn't start with the invasion by Russia in February 2022. That was a major escalation. But the war started in February 2014.
That's such an important point that so many miss in this whole thing. And it's been the goal of the corporate media and the establishment in the U.S. to obscure that fact, to cover over it, pretend it didn't happen, truncate all the antecedents before February of 2022, throw them out the wayside, and then call this unprovoked, Putin's invasion, which it clearly wasn't. 30 years had led up to it, gradually, laying the seeds for this to happen. And like I said, the USAID poured tons of money into this Maidan coup to do this, and this wasn't just an organic uprising. Yes, there were people within Ukraine that organically did not like Yanukovych, for sure. That's obvious. But without pushing it over the wayside, this would never have happened. Without the U.S. there to consummate the finality of the coup, and then you have Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt talking about who had to be part of the provisional government afterward. That phone conversation leaked. You can find it on Google. You can find it on YouTube. But it's very clear that the U.S. was involved. And then you had John McCain and Lindsey Graham standing there saying 2014 will be the year of offense against Russia, kind of rallying the forces, saying that the U.S. has your back. So the U.S. has been involved in provoking this from the jump, especially since 2014. But before that, when it endeavored to go through several waves of NATO expansion.
It escalated. The U.S. built up the Ukrainian military to be the largest standing army of Europe. In fact, by 2021, when Biden came into office, Putin tried one more time. Would you commit, or we call on you to commit to not enlarge NATO to Ukraine? And we've talked about it. I begged Jake Sullivan in a phone call in December 2021, Jake, take the agreement. Are you kidding? Avoid the war. No, we can't do that. NATO open door, so-called. In other words, we're determined to move NATO into Ukraine. And Jeff, don't worry, there won't be a war. Another brilliant utterance of Professor Jake Sullivan. You got everything wrong from beginning to end as
Every single thing wrong, for sure.
far as I'm concerned. So then Russia invaded on February 24th, 2022. And what was the point of that invasion? In our hopeless mainstream media, which is, again, New York Times, I'll use as a reference point, phony from morning till night, it was to take over Ukraine. No, it was not to take over Ukraine. It was to push Ukraine to accept neutrality. This was the point of the invasion. And it was absolutely clear because within 7 days, Zelensky said, okay, we can be neutral. And within a couple of weeks, the Ukrainians had submitted a paper to the Russians to say, why don't we just have neutrality? And the Russians took that paper to President Putin, and Putin said, okay, look, let's negotiate, and we can find a resolution of this. And that's when the so-called Istanbul process began. The Turkish government said, we will be a mediator. I went and talked at length to the Turkish negotiators.
Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister of Israel, also played a role in this, at least kind of mediating there.
To understand all the details about this. But the fact of the matter is, in March 2022, as I was saying earlier, there were very rapid advances of a peace agreement. By March 28, 2022, there was actually a joint communique between Russia and Ukraine saying, we have reached a framework for peace. This is forgotten completely today. Then just 2 weeks later, specifically April 15th, there was a draft agreement on the table. Not everything was agreed. There were some important points, but basically there was an agreement, and serious negotiators would have completed the work. That's when the United States told the Ukrainians, no, you fight on. Now,
yeah, Boris Johnson specifically as well, but that's absolutely true. And what's ironic is Zelensky would have had a much better deal from a pro-Ukraine position at that point in Istanbul in the early months of 2022 than he ever can get at this point now. So now you have Zelensky probably more fearful about the right-wing forces and Azov and Nazis in his country that are coming for his head if he signs on to a peace worse than Istanbul, but he can't get a peace better than Istanbul at this point. It's just an impossibility, especially with Russia occupying so much of the Donbass. And Sachs is right too. There's no indication that Putin ever wanted all of Ukraine proper. Otherwise, he would have had to dedicate thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands more troops than he does now. Certainly hundreds of thousands more to take Ukraine proper and Kyiv. It just doesn't seem conceivable. So that's where we're at, and this war has only escalated lately.
this comes to your question. Why did the U.S. say that then? And why does the war continue now, even though clearly President Trump wants this war to end?
I'm not as convinced of that as Sachs. I certainly wish I was, but so many things lead to my belief that any peace prospect has been sabotaged, including Keith Kellogg in your negotiating team, including, Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal talking to the Ukrainian Commission. You know they're going to fluff them up and say, fight on, we're here for you. Having this strike go through that Trump says, he wasn't aware of directly, it couldn't have been so. At least some part of the Trump administration or deep state had to be aware of a military operation taking 18 months to take place on attacks by Ukrainian drones on Russian nuclear bombers. They had to have known, at least some part of the government up to that point. And it's hard for me to believe that he truly wants peace. If he really wanted peace in Russia, he would withdraw all aid to Ukraine tomorrow. All intelligence resources, all sharing of information tomorrow. That would force a peace. That's the only way where the U.S. wouldn't be viewed as a belligerent from the Russian perspective. That's the point that's being missed. The U.S. is still bankrolling this war. And now it's a different question over whether the Republicans in Congress will come back asking for more aid packages after this $200 billion that's already been spent. But it's not clear that Trump truly wants peace, because the path to peace is clear. It's the same thing that it's always been. Prevent Ukraine from being in NATO. Stop bankrolling this war against Russia over the Donbass. And take your offensive military weaponry out. The Aegis missile launchers can launch Tomahawks, or you could put an H-bomb on the top of them.
Well, it continued then because it was undoubtedly the deep state idea. And I spoke to U.S. government officials. A few of them still spoke to me at the time. I knew senior officials. They absolutely believed that the economic sanctions would bring Russia to its knees, for example. There was once upon a time that cutting Russia out from SWIFT was called the nuclear option. Kind of a mind-boggling ignorance and delusion that America runs everything. So if we put sanctions on Russia, that will crush the Russian economy. They didn't factor in the fact that Russia happens to sell commodities that are easily fungible and that not so hard to direct to India, by the way, which then can resell to Europe. So it's a little bit more costly. It's stupid. It's scratching your left ear with your right arm. You know, it's not the most direct way to do things.
And Russia's already pretty darn sanctioned up. I don't think any of the sanctions have been repealed on Russia, and I think a few of them have been added. And he's exactly right. Russia just gets around this by, proxy trade partners like this. Besides, sanctioning countries generally only hurt the poor people and the people that, need to subsist off an earnest living, off decent conditions and food and supplies. It doesn't really hurt the government, who obtains their wealth through extracting it from the population via taxation and inflation. That's how the government gets their money. The people get their money through trade. And that's why sanctions always hurt the people. And if anything, they actually give a new propaganda avenue for despots and rulers of countries to say, hey, we're in this situation because of how terrible it is from the perspective of people that are opposing us right now.
Everything more expensive, less efficient, but Europe still buys all this stuff. The Indians are middlemen. Of course, they buy a lot of oil for their own refining. China buys gas and oil and so forth. So Russia isn't brought to its knees, but they believed it then. Okay, fast.
Well, not only is Russia not brought to its knees, would you rather have the Russian economy or the American economy right now?
That's an interesting question. Let me come to that in a moment, because I want to address the question why this persists. Okay, so they really believed that there would be victory in short order. And if it wasn't the nuclear option, God, I hate the term because we're close to nuclear war. But if it weren't the nuclear option, so-called, of cutting Russia out of the SWIFT banking system, it would be the HIMARS, it would be the ATACMS, or it was the idea that Putin will never mobilize because that would be so unpopular, it would bring him down. Or it was the idea that there would be an internal coup, Prigozhin, or some other concocted event, and so on. Okay, this was delusion morning till night, very typical of American foreign policy.
Yeah, certainly true. So he gets around it by going into a lot of the history of the war a little bit, but it just doesn't seem like Trump has taken the steps necessary to truly end this war, at least U.S. intervention in this war. Because the endgame from America First Patriots, I believe, in distance, is just get the U.S. uninvolved. let Ukraine scuffle with Russia if they still want to. By the way, if the U.S. does that, they won't still want to. Because it seems like, these commitments from Europe, though Europe has funded to some extent this war, is not going to extend all the way to troops in a hot war versus Russia, invoking Article 5 of the NATO treaty, and then this becomes a literal nuclear war, a hot war between powers. That will not happen. What the U.S. needs to do is withdraw all aid to Ukraine. Trump had the good sense to do that for 6 days. But was that just a show? It seems like it was just a show, because he restored it after that 6 or 7 days over this presumable mineral deal that was never going to come to fruition, not only because it would tie the U.S. closer to Ukraine, which is not what will end this war, but also because the minerals themselves from the Ukrainian mines, most of them are in the east, are in the Donbass that is controlled by Russia by the extent of like 85% at this point. So, and in the hopes of a ceasefire, he restored aid like, hey, Ukraine wants this ceasefire. And then the ceasefire terms that the Russians wanted, they listed them all down the line, were the same they wanted for a peace. No Ukraine in NATO. Get the U.S. to stop bankrolling this war against us. Get this NATO weaponry out of here. Exactly what terms they've always had. That was in the draft treaty that Putin sent to NATO on the eve of this war, saying if you just put it in writing that Ukraine won't be part of NATO, I won't invade Ukraine. And instead of doing that, Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO at the time, pointed this out and he said, Putin got exactly what he didn't want, more war. And, boasting about that he got war when he didn't want to have war. So that's where we're at. Trump hasn't exactly done what's necessary to curtail this war. I hope that changes. Kellogg's influence is crazy. Having Marco Rubio certainly doesn't help. And I think Witkoff's the only one that's put an honest effort to securing the peace there from the Trump administration standpoint in regard to Trump's diplomatic team. So we'll see how this pans out. Let me know in the comments below. Do you see a peace coming with Russia anytime soon? Because I don't right now. I do want to hear from you on that, though. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, consider becoming a YouTube member or Patreon patron. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.